Welcome to IFP. I fix everything.
Today's project is a 1986 Pontiac Fiero with a worn inner tie rod end. I'll show you how to test it and how to replace it. Grab the wheel at the 3 o'clock and 9 o'clock position and try to force the wheel to turn, both inward and outward. I removed the wheel and trained a camera on the steering linkage. Then I rotated the wheel hub. As the wheel hits the steering stops, if you watch carefully, you'll see the bellows bounce. I increased my leverage by using 2 box wrenches and holding them securely with the lug nuts. This is normally a 2-person job. Now you can do it alone, even without a camera. It can also be done by just turning the steering wheel while focusing the camera tightly on the steering linkage. To remove the inner tie rod end, the outer tie rod end must be disconnected. I applied Lennox tapping oil to the jam nut. It allows rusted fasteners to be removed much more easily. I used a 22mm wrench to break the jam nut free. I used an alternate method on the passenger side. I traded my 22mm wrench for a 7/8" crow's foot and a large ratchet. I was able to break the jam nut free without lubrication quite easily. I let the oil soak into the castellated nut as I removed the cotter pin. Then I removed the nut with a cordless impact driver. I separated the tie rod end with a heavy hammer and a ball joint splitter, commonly known as a pickle fork. Here I am on the passenger side again. I used no oil. I was able to remove the cotter pin completely by hand, and I was able to remove the castellated nut without the use of an impact driver. And once again, I used the pickle fork and a large hammer to separate the tie rod end. I unthreaded the greasy tie rod end by hand and set it in a plastic tray for cleaning. On the passenger side, I decided I would clean the tie rod end while it's still installed on the car. I was able to use it as a support and rotate it around on the threads and clean all sides easily. With the jam nut returned to its seated position, I spray painted the threads so I could easily count or measure them for reinstallation. I set the depth stop of my dial caliper against the jam nut and locked the thumb screw in place so it could be reutilized on the new installation. I used long-handled needle nose pliers to remove the bellows clamp, but most any pliers would work. Insert a cotter pin extractor into the crimped ear of the inner bellows clamp and wedge it against the frame support and it will pop free. This method works on the bellows on each side. The driver's side bellows can now be rotated and it will slide free from the tie rod end. With the bellows removed, you can now see the inner tie rod end connection on the driver's side. The steering damper must be removed to remove the passenger side bellows. Remove the nut and washer from each end of the steering damper and it will slide free. To make the job easier, I used a lever to unseat the rod ends. Next, remove the stud from the bellows. Remove the crimped clamp with the cotter pin extractor and rotate the bellows free. Rotate the steering wheel all the way to the right to allow clearance for the tie rod removal tool on the driver's side. The tool I chose is a Lyle inner tie rod tool 45750. If you look carefully, you'll see it's made in USA. I've had it for about 20 years. Seat the wrench adapter on the tube flats of the inner tie rod end. Slip the tube over the tie rod end, engage the 2 lugs into the 2 special slots, and rotate the lock ring to secure the assembly. To maintain the seat with the tie rod end, apply outward pressure as you rotate the ratchet. After a couple of revolutions with the ratchet, I was able to remove the ratchet, rotate the tie rod tool by hand, and remove the assembly. To remove the tie rod end from the adapter, tip the tube to disengage the flats, then rotate the locking ring and rotate the wrench adapter to remove it from the lugs. The tie rod removal tool had adequate clearance on the passenger side without rotating the rack and pinion. The passenger side removal process is exactly the same. However, the video may be a little more refined. With the old ones removed, it was time to do a comparison between the old and the new. The first thing I noticed, the new product from Delphi was longer. That meant the thread count or the original setting on the caliper would not be the same. I had to increase the depth of the jam nut approximately 1/8 inch. I had to switch to a smaller size wrench adapter also. Thread the tie rod end onto the rack and pinion by hand to ensure no cross threading. Install the tie rod removal tool and tighten by hand. The next step is to torque the tie rod end. Apply a backing wrench to the flats of the steering shaft and torque to 70 foot-pounds. Give the tie rod some physical therapy. Run it through its full range of motion to be sure it operates smoothly. The inner barrel of the tie rod end must be peened to ensure the threads don't loosen over time. A hammer and a punch will work, but I find an impact driver works more efficiently. I cleaned the steering shaft with a toothbrush to remove the old grease. I applied Lucas red and tacky grease to the shaft. It's designed for open gears and sliding surfaces. I cleaned the outer tie rod ends with degreaser. Then I pumped fresh grease into the fittings and forced out the old contaminated grease. I cleaned that up and then started again. I forced new grease in until I seen new grease come out. While the grease gun was out, I went to the front end and greased the upper and the lower ball joints. These new bellows I'm installing are actually the old bellows. I just cleaned them with degreaser and a brush. I ordered new bellows and they sent me a universal fit that did not fit. Place the crimp ring on the rack and pinion first, then slide the bellows on until it snaps into the groove on the rack and pinion. Slide the crimp ring over the bellows and crimp it securely, and test it to be sure it won't slide off in the future and destroy the rack and pinion. The pliers I used are sold in the plumbing department. They're often used for sprinkler system clamps. Seat the rectangular window of the boot with the metal receiver below. Install the damper stud and tighten with a crow's foot to 36 foot-pounds. Install the damper with the piston extended to the passenger side and install the two nuts and torque to 36 foot-pounds. Install the outer clamp and then install the jam nut. I set the jam nut to the original depth, installed the tie rod end, then added one additional 1/8 inch to compensate for the longer tie rod end. Align the tie rod end with the steering knuckle, press into place, and install the castellated nut. The initial torque on the castellated nut is 28 foot-pounds. Then reset the torque wrench to no more than 36 foot-pounds and rotate the castellated nut no more than 1/6 of a turn to align the cotter pin. With the tie rod ends torqued, the ball joints can now be greased, filling the seals to capacity. The job is complete. It's time to install the wheels and torque the lug nuts to 100 foot-pounds in a star pattern. The car now travels straight as an arrow with its new 4-wheel alignment. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please like and share. Subscribers are always welcome.